now.
Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt Grace Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today, we're on a season 5 apologetics episode. We're going to be doing New Testament manuscript issues. We have 2 guests on today with us. Both of them edited a book, Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism. We have Elijah Hixson and Peter Gurry on. And if you guys are on YouTube, you can see what this book is that they helped edit. It is published by IVP. This is not a book club episode, but we're using the book to kind of help this conversation, and we'll still want to make sure we promote this book for you guys, but it is more of an apologetics season 5 episode. So we'll jump into this episode and this conversation here in a moment on New Testament manuscript issues. But first, just some housekeeping, show notes, reminders, those kind of things. Go to IVP's link that we have, find out that, see this book for yourself, purchase it for you or someone you know. Also, we have a link to find confessional and Reformed churches near your area. So all you need to do is hit that link, type in your zip code, and you will find the closest churches near you if you're not already at a church. And you can also send that link to someone that lives in a different area, and it should work pretty much anywhere. So the most important thing we say on the show is obviously that you're at a local church that you call home. You're worshiping our holy God in person as he prescribes us to do so. So please, we can't stress that enough, to be at a local church and be known. Also, you can contact Peter or myself, ask us questions and that kind of thing about the podcast itself. You can interact with us, find us on YouTube, and as well as Twitter and Instagram. And you could email us, of course. Email is guiltgracepod@gmail.com. Both Instagram and Twitter are the same handles, so it's pretty easy to find us. It's at guiltgracepod. And then for YouTube, even easier, you go to YouTube and you just type in our podcast name, Guilt Grace Gratitude Podcast, and hit subscribe. And these conversations, because the way they're recorded, are actually automatically the videos recorded with them, so you can just see what this conversation looks like. So if that's a better method for you versus the audio podcast version. And then also, you heard me mention Logos Bible Software, our main sponsor. They are what we call a bridge builder among other sponsors we have, and individuals like you that graciously donate to us to keep our show moving forward. As we're growing, we need more bandwidth, we need more help, so we can keep this going. We do multiple episodes per week, so there's a lot to take on the back end. So it's very helpful to have those funds to keep moving forward. Through about the middle of this episode, you'll hear some words from our sponsors as well. Our especially publishers, they've been very gracious to us over the course of us doing this podcast the last couple of years. So with, I don't think I have anything else to say. I'll let Peter further introduce Elijah Hixson and Peter Gurry.
Yeah, we have Elijah Hixson, who's recently joined the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts as a research fellow after completing his doctoral thesis published as Scribal Habits in Sixth-Century Greek Purple Codices. And he served at Tyndale House in Cambridge. His areas include New Testament textual criticism, which we're talking about right now, peparology, and early Christian theology, C.H. Spurgeon, and apologetics, as well as Dr. Peter Gurry, who's associate professor of New Testament, director of Text Canon Institute at Phoenix Seminary. And we've had Dr. Stephen Dubey. I was about to say Gooby because I just said Gurry, but Dr. Stephen Dubey on his book, Jesus and the God of Classical Theism, on recently last month. So you guys want to check that out as well. But it's a pleasure having you both on. Thanks for coming on.
It's great to be here.
A pleasure.
So maybe we can start off a little bit. Elijah, if you want to tell our audience a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, maybe a little bit of background, and what got you into textual criticism?
Yeah, so I live in East Tennessee. It's where I grew up. I'm from here. I work remotely for CSNTM, and I've been there for about 2 years now. There's kind of two reasons that I came to textual criticism that both kind of converged. One is I grew up in a church that used the King James until I was about 12. We switched to the New King James, which was
big switch.
Southern Baptist Church, though. But most of the churches around us, most of them were either King James only, and I don't mean like Peter Ruckman King James only, but independent fundamental Baptist churches, or they were liberal. And so if you wanted to do any kind of working together with other churches that were sufficiently like-minded, just the King James is just a default. My youth pastor was King James only, and I really appreciated him because he taught us the Bible. We didn't just have pizza parties and fun and games. He actually taught us the Bible. And that's one thing that I always appreciated about all of these other independent fundamental Baptist churches around us, is that these are people that take the Bible very seriously. So I knew if I'm going to break from that, I've got to know my stuff really well. The other half of that is just the way my mind works. I like measuring things. I like things that you can see and measure. So I was a chemistry major as my undergrad, and with a manuscript, you kind of get as much of that as you can in the bigger field of theology. Is this an alpha or is it a lambda? There is an objective answer to that. We can't always know for sure what the objective answer is, but like you can make a measurement and you can see things. And so I just found textual criticism, manuscripts in particular, to be really fascinating. And that sort of captivated me in a way that other aspects of theology didn't. These are copies of God's word. These are my Bible here. When I'm looking at a manuscript, I'm looking at somebody else's this thing, and I just find that fascinating.
That's awesome. And Dr. Gurry, you're the first Peter we've had on the show besides me. So how'd you get into this stuff?
I got to this stuff through taking a Greek course in high school, and somewhere along the way in that
You took a Greek course in high school?
Yeah, I went to a Christian school and I had the option of taking Spanish or Greek. And it seemed like everybody took Spanish, so that seemed boring to me. So
my option was Spanish or Latin, and I did Latin for the same reason.
Okay.
Go. So I still remember, I think it was maybe the second or third year of that class that we got a Greek New Testament finally. And I was a kind of early, young Greek student that was correcting my NIV Bible with my pencil, I think you're wrong because I knew, 1 year of high school Greek.
Makes you an expert. Yeah.
Expert, yeah. But I thought it was fascinating. I had kind of grown up my whole life reading the Bible at that point, and didn't really know hardly anything about how we got it. And so to know that there was this Greek New Testament that I could now read, kind of, behind my English Bible just fascinated me. And then when I got to Bible college later, I learned about the manuscripts behind my printed Greek New Testament. So it's kind of a gradual process of just going one step further back in the process at each stage and being fascinated at each one with kind of how we go from one step to the next.
Yeah. And so, Dr. Gurry, maybe we'll start with you on this question. This is not a book to introduce textual criticism proper. So like you guys talk about in your introduction, but how we should approach topics around the New Testament manuscripts, transmission, and translations, as well as how we shouldn't. So what first interested you in both editing a volume on various aspects of these issues? Again, not introducing this stuff, but saying, okay, here's how we shouldn't do it, and here's maybe how we should approach this.
Yeah. Well, the blame all goes to Hixson, really.
Okay.
With the idea. But basically, Hixson and I both at the time were both doing PhDs in New Testament text criticism. So we'd already been really interested in it in our seminary education, and we're now doing PhDs in it. And basically, it was as simple as we kept kind of seeing a series of apologetic let's call them hot takes, that were saying things that we knew were wrong or misinformed. And I think what really kind of put us over the edge was that they were often coming across very like really confident, kind of triumphalistic. So oftentimes it kind of had and to be fair, they were responding to kind of sensationalism on the other side.
Yeah.
So there was kind of stuff where people would say things like, well, you can't possibly trust in Jesus because you don't even know what the New Testament says because there's too many variants. In my opinion, that's rather silly. But it was kind of like an opposite reaction then, to take little things that were like little pieces of data that either at one point were true or were partly true, and then blow them out of proportion or get them wrong in the process. And so Hixson just kind of like, I don't know, he finally read one that probably put him over the edge a bit, and he because we need to get together, get people to write on, kind of take one of these kind of myths that's out, one of these misinformed kind of gotcha apologetics claim, and write one chapter on each one. And so that was kind of the idea for it. And we were still, I don't know, Hixson, where were we, like first or second year of our PhDs at that point? Is that right? I think probably second, maybe.
Something like that. I think you did start yours a year before me.
Yeah, that's right. It might have been a year in front of you. So then we just started picking the people that we wanted to. And part of what we wanted to do was to get new people to write on it. And that was a bit of a challenge because publishers don't love to publish a bunch of people who've never written anything.
That's right. Yeah, because it doesn't sell. Yeah.
Their part. And but for our perspective, it was kind of actually essential that we did that, because we felt like a lot of the people who had been publishing on it, some of them were the people we felt needed to be corrected in some places. So I think the important thing is we tried to do it respectfully. Hopefully we succeeded. There's a little bit of risk when you're young of sort of being the young gun and coming in and saying, hey, all you old guys are wrong.
Yeah.
We did want to try to avoid that, but at the same time, we also wanted young contributors who weren't just going to rehash something that they had done 20 years ago, if that makes sense. I mean, frankly, that's sometimes what happens when you've had a long career and you're asked to write on something, you go back and draw on stuff you did 20 years ago, and that can happen. But we really wanted to have a bit more of a fresh take on the issues. So that's kind of the impetus of how we wrote it.
Yeah. So Dr. Hixson, what put you over the edge to say like, hey, we gotta do this?
Is it a wise decision for me to say that?
You don't have to name out the scholar or anything, but just maybe it was like, what's the straw that broke the camel's back? They're like, oh man, we gotta edit something to do this.
There was a book, and a chapter of the book got published in a couple of places as a blog post, and there were some responses to it from really competent people. Pete's doctoral supervisor was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was reading the comments on that, is that the post where like the first comment is, why you so cranky, bro? And you're just like, well, this is a respected source of information. Who are you to be criticizing it? Like, it's a guy who's had a couple decades of expertise in this area. That's who is criticizing it. And it just sort of like, the whole mix of it just frustrated me. And it's like, we got to do something. There's like, somebody's got to do something. And it's an important enough task, and it requires so many different areas of sort of subspecialization that, to me, the only responsible ways to do it would be to have somebody who is at the end of their career and who has spent the lifetime getting expertise in all of these little areas, but most of those people are extremely busy and don't have time. Or let it be a team effort. And if it's a team effort, there needs to be more than one editor, because you need to have two people who can each see what the other misses. And so it just made sense to get, off the top of my head, Matt Solomon had recently written his dissertation on looking at all of the manuscripts of Philemon. To me, that's a significant piece of work, just because nobody else has done that. And when you do something like that, you have a good perspective on sort of big picture things that not everybody would automatically have, not having looked at all of the manuscripts of a particular book of the Bible.
Yeah. Before Nick asks his next question, kind of digging into some of this stuff. If they weren't known then, if they're younger scholars, I think most of them are still younger scholars now, but we've had Greg Lanier on before on the show on the Septuagint. So he's produced a lot of work since then. He's continuing to produce more work. And I think Zach Cole is now professor RTS. So there's a couple guys that you got kind of at the beginning of their careers who are kind of now making a name for themselves in New Testament manuscripts, Old Testament manuscripts, and building on this stuff. So they're not just like kind of new and green and don't know what they're doing. It's they're really, really good. And so people who read this book get to see kind of like a scholar, both beginning, but also like actually really good research on this stuff. People want to learn a little bit more about this. You kind of get little bite-sized pieces of each of these to kind of start you off on your journey.
Yeah. And we like to define terms on our show for our broad audience. And so before I kind of jump into my first real question, this could be a very simple, quick definition, but can somebody just define textual criticism for the audience?
So whenever you read anything, there is a text, a real text, right? But we know that mistakes happen in the process of printing it, or especially in handwriting it. And so it's textual criticism at its core is sifting through those to get at what the text is. I mean, there's more to it than that, but historically that's been the goal of textual criticism, to get the original text. And we do it all the time. We do it when we read blogs and see a typo, we intuitively understand that that's a typo, and so we intuitively understand what the word should be, even though that's not what the witness to the text says.
Mm-hmm.
I can't find it, but there's a spot in this is an ESV, and there's in the Psalms, there's a place in this edition where, sometimes you have those tiny little superscript letters that identify the cross references.
Mm-hmm.
In the Psalms, there's a spot where there's just a regular R in a space between two words. And it's obvious that was supposed to be a little superscript R because it's referencing a cross reference in the middle. But technically that's a textual variant, right? And so the textual criticism is sort of seeing those kinds of things and sifting through them to figure out what's going on.
Gotcha.
Okay, cool. So here's my first question. You make the point early on, which each essay dives into, that we should avoid two extremes when dealing with these issues: radical skepticism around the evidence and absolute certainty. And why is this so important to set out in the beginning? I guess I could go with Peter first.
I think partly because we wanted to say there are extremes in this question, and you can be extreme in at least two directions on this, So we also want to set out really clearly at the beginning that although in the book we try to correct misinformation used by Christian apologists, we actually do fundamentally agree with the apologetics conclusion that the trustworthy, that textual variants in the New Testament manuscripts are not a good reason or a good argument against the Christian faith. So we want to kind of set that up right away and say, actually, we agree with the conclusion. Our problem is more with how apologists tend to get there. And that's what we wanted to correct. And then, so on the one side, we're not in favor of the skepticism of somebody like Bart Ehrman, who thinks that textual variants are a good reason to not believe in the inspiration of the Bible.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, while we apologists that actually there is good reason to believe in the inspiration of the Bible, the arguments that we've been using to get there are sometimes outdated or misinformed. So we just want to kind of say, hey, we're walking this line here between these two things.
Yeah. Dr. Hixson, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, when I look at the two extremes, radical skepticism and absolute certainty, the way I see it, and this may sound heretical, and I apologize if it does. I don't mean it to be. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, right? At the end of the day, without faith, it's impossible to please. Hebrews 11. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And what it's in Romans, hope that is seen is not hope. And so if we have to have absolute certainty, then to me, fundamentally, that's hope that is seen, which is not hope. And I'm not saying that people who are all for absolute certainty like don't have real faith. They do. I'm very thankful that God saves inconsistent people, because that's definitely me. But it seems to be that I don't want to say that I have to have absolute certainty in every area to have any confidence at all. I mean, we can know by faith that our salvation is in Jesus, and that we're saved by Jesus, by the blood of Jesus. That's something we can be absolutely certain in by faith. And so, yeah, and the fact is that as I see it, the manuscripts just don't reflect the claims that a lot of people who say we have to have absolute certainty make. And so what happens is either you have to sort of bury your head in the sand and say, I'm not going to look at that. I'm not going to think about that. And I mean, for some people, like, I have no problems with people saying, look, textual criticism is hard. I don't understand it. There's things that don't look right to me. So I know that I can trust the King James. And so that's what I'm going to do. Like, that's a great reason to use it. It has confidence in God's word. It has confidence in God to preserve his word sufficiently. It has humility to say there may be something that I don't know and I don't understand. Like, that's great. But on the other side, it can wreck people's faith. So like, people point to Bart Ehrman as, having all these arguments that wreck people's faith. And the way I see it, like, it only wrecks your faith if your faith is built on bad information that's already not true. Like, if something's not true, it's not true. And if you are clinging to it and saying this has to be true for me to have faith, then that's a bad situation altogether.
Yeah, that actually, not to be off topic at all, quick comment, that what you were saying, Elijah, with the absolute certainty versus just having faith, kind of reminds me of just doubting Thomas. I mean, he was saved. For as far as we can understand, for sure, we can be confident in that. And he had faith, but he also was called the doubting Thomas because he wanted absolute certainty, seeing the resurrected Jesus. I mean, seeing, like, I'll believe when I actually get to touch him and see him. Versus the rest of the disciples are like, yeah, we believe. So,
and then he actually did get to touch Jesus.
Yep, exactly. So, sorry if that was a little off topic. It just popped up in my head when you were talking about it.
Yeah.
I mean, the line that I kind of repeat to myself all the time is, I believe, help my unbelief.
Yes.
I believe, that's the first part. That is, so whatever questions that I have after that, I believe.
Yeah.
And so whatever questions after that don't matter ultimately, like, they do matter. Of course they do matter. And I want to resolve them. That's where the help my unbelief comes in, but that's secondary. It's not primary.
Yes and amen. Yeah, good. So here's a pretty meaty question. It's very practical. So if people want to peel the onion back and are waiting for some maybe examples, here we go. And then I'm going to let kind of Peter do the rest of the questions. So give me a little patience, audience, and you guys, to kind of unpack this. So without having to exhaustively cover each chapter of the book, we don't have time for that. But what are some of the biggest issues surrounding New Testament textual criticism, and the pitfalls we should avoid when discussing these? And positively, what's a better way forward? So there's three well-known examples that you cover: the number of manuscripts we have compared to other classic works of literature, And then 2, the number of corrections, usually counted between, you say 400,000 to 750,000, and among the manuscripts. And 3, the issue that the older the manuscripts are, the better. So hopefully that made sense. Let me know if you guys need help with the question.
Yeah, Dr. Gurry, if you want to talk about that one first.
Okay, so I think that's probably come from the introduction. We'll relay out kind of just three quick common ones. And so let's start with the number of manuscripts. That's a big one. What's tended to happen is, if you go back to the 1940s, F.F. Bruce, who's a great New Testament scholar and evangelical, published a book on why you can trust the New Testament documents.
Yeah.
And in it, he makes a pretty good argument against a certain kind of skeptic. And there's a certain kind of skeptic who says something like, hey, we have, the manuscripts of the New Testament are later and they have all these differences, so we can't trust the New Testament because the manuscript evidence is not good enough. And F.F. Bruce was a well-trained classicist, besides being a New Testament scholar. And Bruce knew that, hey, if you apply that rigorous standard, if you have that high of a bar for the New Testament, nothing in the classical world is going to measure up to that even close. And so Bruce basically just calls the skeptic on it and says, look, if you're going to be a skeptic about the New Testament for that, you have way more reason to be a skeptic about everything else in the classical world that you say you know about it. And so he has a little table in that book where he lays out a comparison of the number of manuscripts in the New Testament versus things like Homer, and I think Tacitus is in there, and a few other classical authors like that. And it's a good argument against a certain kind of skeptic. The problem is, over time, people picked up on his good argument and just kept repeating it. And they kept repeating the number of manuscripts for the classical authors that he gives from 1940 to 1940s. Meanwhile, find the absolute highest number, the latest number they could find for the New Testament manuscripts. Well, from 1940 to today, we've discovered more New Testament manuscripts, which is great. So the number on the New Testament side of the comparison kept going up. Okay. Meanwhile, the number on the classical authors just stayed the same for about 60 days, now 80 years from then. And so that's a problem, right? You get into an unfair comparison, right? You find the biggest number on the New Testament side, but then you're using 60 to 80-year-old data on the classical side. And that's a bit of a problem because the very argument depends on a comparison.
Yeah. And it's not an update comparison anymore.
Bruce is calling people out for an unfair comparison on that side, and now we're the ones guilty of an unfair comparison on our side. Okay. The other problem with that argument can be that Bruce used the argument in a very limited way. He said, if you're a skeptic for the New Testament, you should be a skeptic for the classical authors as well. Some people are willing to just bite that dilemma. They'll just give into the dilemma. So I've heard Bart Ehrman say, for example, well, yeah, I am skeptical about both. Okay. Well, in that case, okay, there's not really much you can do. On the other hand, other people have changed Bruce's argument without realizing it, and said, because the New Testament has so many more manuscripts and classical authors, it's that much more reliable. Never made the argument that way. And frankly, the argument doesn't really work that way, because more manuscripts does not necessarily guarantee a more accurate text to that same degree. To put it in perspective, we have far more manuscripts of the Gospels than we have of Revelation. Yeah. But nobody would say, no Christian would want to say, no apologist would want to say, therefore the text of the Gospels is 4 times more certain than the text of Revelation is. Do you see? So there's a bit of a problem in that, 1, the numbers were not updated over time, and then 2, the argument actually shifted a little bit over time, to a way that I don't think actually he ever intended it to work. So that's one, and that one gets repeated almost any time.
I've heard that. Yeah, I've said it myself. When I read it, I was like, oh, I should eat my words.
There's a third problem with it as well.
Sorry, go ahead, Hixson.
So there's a third problem with it as well, is that Bruce was giving a functional count. So when we kind of sit down, we functionally depend on this many manuscripts. We can have plenty of other fragments, but they aren't really things that we're depending on for the text. And so that's a much lower number than the full number of manuscripts.
That's right.
And if we did that for the New Testament, we'd have to have a lower number than the 5,000 also. But the way that can end up in derivative apologetic works is, this is how many manuscripts there are of Homer and everything else, when that's not exactly that's not the nuance that Bruce was giving. He was saying
Gotcha.
This is how many we depend on.
Gotcha. Yeah.
We should probably say that I think in the way he uses the argument, right, originally, if you update the numbers on both sides of the comparison, I think his basic argument does still work. That if you want to be skeptical about the New Testament because there aren't enough manuscripts for it, you probably do need to be much more skeptical about everything else from the classical world. Okay. So another way to say it positively is we are really blessed with a lot of manuscripts when it comes to the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
As much as text critics might want more manuscripts, and we always do, actually want more earlier, but it's like, 200 years ago, they didn't have any manuscripts predating the 4th century in Greek. And now we have Greek manuscripts going back to the 2nd century. Well, what happens? New Testament scholars now want something from the 1st century. Well, shocking, humans are never quite satisfied.
Yeah.
Could discover 5 manuscripts from the 2nd century, and you'd still have New Testament scholars then, 20 years from now going, well, yeah, but we don't have anything for the 1st century. So, in other words, the point is that if you really want to be skeptical, you'll find a reason to be skeptical. You just,
Yeah.
and Bruce is kind of calling that out in his book. And I think in that way, the argument still has value. So
Yeah.
that's another myth that's pretty common is the number of variants. That one there has all kinds of sort of mistakes associated with it, partly because for a long time, scholars just kind of threw out numbers. And even when they did throw out numbers that were based on sort of a good sensibility of manuscripts and of textual criticism, they still didn't tell us where they got the number. So they just say things like, well, there's 100,000 variants. Well, what kind of variants? And variants in what? In manuscripts or in patristic citations or in the early translations of the New Testament? Like, what are we actually counting as a variant here? At one point in my PhD, I sat down and wrote an article on that and sat down and looked at the places where we actually do have really good data on how many variants we have. And we only have really good data in a few little parts of the New Testament because it's just too much work, frankly. So I went through and I counted the number of variants in those places and then estimated based on that, did an extrapolation from there. And just try to be really clear about, hey, what exactly are we estimating? I'm not estimating spelling differences because most of the big editions that do collect variants don't actually include spelling differences. And frankly, because they don't affect the meaning at all. So they're not that big. So I came to the conclusion that a good estimate is about 500,000 variants. But the main point of going through that process was to say, let's be really clear about what we're saying, okay? And then people say things like, well, the variants are only found in, this 9% of the New Testament. I don't even know what that means, frankly.
Yeah.
Percent of the New Testament, like, no, that's variants are all through the New Testament. The scribes copied the whole thing, and copying's hard, and they made mistakes. There are some parts of the New Testament that really are harder to copy, right? When Jesus gives lists of people that he healed, and he gives like 5 types of people that he healed, lepers and deaf people and et cetera, et cetera. It's really easy to get a list like that confused. And
lists in general are difficult.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. So I just at our church recently, the kids have been learning the fruit of the Spirit, which is a list. And you can hear when they recite it back exactly the same problems that we see in copying. One gets left out or the order gets switched. I mean, it's exactly the same thing that happens in the scribal tradition.
Yeah. So there's 2 of the myths, guys. Each chapter tackles a different myth.
Yep.
And then what we do that we hope is helpful, especially to apologists, is we start by saying, here's what the myth is. Here's kind of how it's used in Christian literature. Then we correct it. And then at the end of the chapter, we give kind of a summary statement of what you should say instead. So, what not to say. And then in light of what is actually we know about manuscripts and scribes, etc., here's what you can say instead, or here's how you can use this argument instead. So we didn't just want to sort of pull the rug out from under Christian apologists. The goal really was to help them in the end. Yeah,
I thought that was the way the book was written, because it's not like you said, it's not primarily written to skeptics. It's saying, hey, this is how you better understand it. It's like you said, it's written, which is exactly what we're trying to do in the show. It's written to those who are trying to understand, how do I defend the manuscripts better in a way that's actually defendable by the manuscript tradition and by its Scribal tradition, all that stuff, instead of just like kind of pulling arguments from somewhere else that you got and saying like, hey, this is the stuff that they've said before 50 years ago. Things I haven't really checked if they've changed or not. And if somebody actually checks my work, then like you talk about in the book, and like a lot of authors talk about in the book, then that could be really detrimental to our defense of the faith when people check our work and say, oh, actually, that's not true, what you had said before, which I thought was really helpful in how the editors talked about this.
As Christian apologists, if we're not concerned about getting things right,
yeah,
we shouldn't be doing it, right? I mean,
exactly. Yep.
It's just as important that the way we argue has integrity as it is that the conclusion we're arguing for has integrity.
Yeah, we're not, like you said, we're not just trying to, I think we're not just trying to win points. We're not just trying to like beat somebody over the head by saying this. We're actually like, we're trying to be faithful to what it is, and as much as we can, as we're reading good works like this, bring up the latest data, and even if it doesn't agree with what we had previously thought, then we go back to the data and say, okay, what's actually the case when it comes to the manuscripts? And like you said, the Spirit will show forth in those who are hearing this, and it's not necessarily evidence that's going to change somebody's mind, which it could. It's the Spirit that's going to work through their body or their mind and say, okay, we're now going to say, yeah, Jesus is Lord, not necessarily just off the manuscripts, but off of kind of the whole conversation.
And look, I think all of us want the kind of knockdown argument that wows people.
Yeah.
And, oh, wow. And that's fine. If you get one of those arguments, great, use it. I have no problem in your audience. But I think sometimes we forget how we can actually win people over by admitting when we're wrong. That, I mean, if you think about it, that's sort of the heart of the Christian faith, is admitting that we're wrong, right? Like, so
many were sinners. Yeah, exactly.
Actually attracting people to. We're not attracting people to, the ability to impress people. That's not what the Christian faith is. What we're hopefully attracting people to is a religion, a faith that says we are fundamentally wrong, like we are fundamentally in a bad place, and admitting we're wrong is the start of this entire religion. That's where we start. That's our starting point, right? And we happen to know somebody who, when we repent, is able to actually address our problem. So like, that should just be, in my opinion, kind of second nature to Christians, to admit that we're wrong and say, oh yeah, I was wrong about that, thanks for pointing that out, let me get that right.
Yeah, totally.
And part of that comes with, when there are arguments that we don't have a good response to, just saying, you know what, that's a good point, I'll think about that. Doesn't mean you have to give up the Christian faith the first time you meet some really argument on the other side. There's been times in my life where I've come across really good arguments against the Christian faith, and I've had to just say, you know what, I don't have a good answer to that right now, let me think about it for a while.
Yeah. And maybe if we can dig into just, if you guys want to describe, maybe we'll start with Elijah first. What is your specific discipline in New Testament criticism, and how can our listeners, maybe you can provide some helpful understanding of it, and how to engage with this apologetically as it relates to your discipline?
I wrote my dissertation on Scribal Habits.
Okay.
And I think fundamentally there was probably an apologetic undertone for why I wanted to do that, because I want to know, how were the manuscripts copied? How can we know, like,
which is a relatively big deal with some of these things too.
Right. We can't get in a time machine and go back and look over their shoulder to see what they were doing. We can't read their minds. And so what can we do? Well, one of the ways that you can get at that question, I won't say answer it, but get at that question, is look for all the ways that a manuscript is unique and unlike anything else, because those are places where almost everybody agrees that this is not the original text, right? If this is the only manuscript that has it, no matter which side you're on, the odds are, in most cases, that is a change. And so if you add all of those up and then look at the patterns that you see, you can see patterns of change. There's a question about whether or not that method actually works, or to what degree it works, which is specifically what I addressed. But I think it does help us see tendencies of manuscripts. And so apologetically, how that becomes relevant is you hear a lot about corruptions of scripture or orthodox corruptions.
They're like trying to change the text intentionally for some like orthodox
Right.
reason, whatever it is.
And that actually comes from both people like Bart Ehrman and people who are King James Textus Receptus people. Somebody like Bart Ehrman is going to say, well, the Orthodox Christians changed it to, put their theology in power. On the other side, you'll say, well, we have the pure version and the heretics changed it to undermine doctrine. When you actually look at specific instances, and it's hard to deny that probably played into some textual variants in some way, played into it somehow. But when you look at example after example after example of specific instances that are claimed as that, it's really hard to conclude that that's what was going on, because in a lot of cases, it's a substitution. And we know that substitutions happen across the board. They don't just happen in theologically hot verses, or this is an omission. Well, that's omitting the deity of Christ. Or is it just words drop out? And we know that words drop out because we see words drop out all over the place.
So it's not just like relegated to theologically significant passages. It tends to be dispersed everywhere.
Right. And so the impression that I get is if somebody was wanting to corrupt the scriptures to force their doctrine, in most cases, they did a really terrible job of it. But there's a couple of manuscripts where there does seem to be evidence of that. But the thing about that is, if there's evidence of that, that means that we can spot it.
Yep.
And that means it's not a problem for us.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah, Dr. Gurry, what was your specific discipline, and how can we engage better apologetically with it?
Well, like Elijah, I worked on text criticism. Specifically, I worked on a computer-assisted method for helping us make textual decisions called coherence-based genealogical method. It's fantastic name. The reason I worked on it is because it's being used to edit the standard Greek New Testament that is used in seminaries that Bible translators use around the world. And so I wanted to understand why the editors were using it to make changes.
I got mine right here, right next to
John 28.
Yep.
The Catholic letters are affected by the coherence-based genealogical method. One of the things interesting is that in my work, I did get to think a fair bit about kind of statistics and manuscript relationships. And it's pretty remarkable when you see the statistics on how much manuscripts agree with each other. You take a manuscript from like the 4th century, compare it to a manuscript copied in the 15th century, and they often agree at something like well over a high 80%, like 87, 88% of all places where there's variance in the manuscripts. And that's pretty remarkable. In other cases, we have some really carefully copied manuscripts that are like form a particular little group. And we happen to know that the ancestor of that text goes all the way back to the 7th century. So I worked on a text that has an ancestor in the 7th century. All of our copies of it in Greek are from like the 12th and 13th and 14th century. And yet their texts are so close that we can identify a really close relationship with them. I'll put it that way. So that's just pretty cool to see that statistically. It's really hard to deny that. Scribes did make mistakes, but they also were some that were really careful and were able to transmit almost the exact same text across 700-800 years. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, which is I think there's a chapter in the book. I don't remember if you wrote this one or somebody else wrote this one on like later manuscripts. So if we're looking at like a 2nd century manuscript versus like a 15th, it doesn't necessarily mean if you have a 15th century manuscript, it's worse than the 2nd century one. If it's based off an ancestor, so like an older manuscript that's very faithful and it agrees with that. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's Greg Lanier's chapter, and it's just a reminder to us that the date of a manuscript, of its parchment and ink, is not the same thing as the date of its text. Its text can preserve a text that's much older than the parchment and the ink, right?
Yeah.
Scribes could copy from manuscripts that were way older than the manuscript they were making that was new.
Yeah. So it's not just, although it does play a role, it's not just the date of the manuscript that gives its like viability. It's what is it copying that gives it its viability, and how close to that copy is it?
Yep. That's it.
Gotcha. Okay. So I'll skip my next question. You guys more or less talked about like understanding some of the issues and like kind of downplaying some of these things, and that being kind of hurtful to the witness to some of these. So as we wrap up, Elijah, I'll start with you on this one. How can we better engage? Because most, if not all, who listen to this, they're not professional text critics, so they're not going to be reading a bunch of books and going looking at the Greek manuscripts and like figuring out, okay, how do we change some of these things, and how do we understand these things, and how do I engage my next door neighbor? I'm going to bring them all my Greek manuscripts with me, and I'm gonna convert them to the faith. So people who listen to this don't do that. So how do we better engage with some of this stuff without either underemphasizing the differences or despairing at like, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff that we don't know about the manuscripts?
We can have confidence in the God who gave us the scriptures. Like fundamentally,
yeah,
that's who I'm trusting. I'm trusting in Jesus. I'm trusting that Jesus is real and he did save me. As far as how to defend that, my number one rule of thumb that I tell everybody all the time is, if it sounds too good to be true, assume it is. It may be true. It might. But if you come across a piece of evidence that you're like, wow, this just totally destroys whatever argument that you've heard, and you've never heard that piece of evidence before, just assume that it's too good to be true, and assume that there's something like it may be, but wait it out and see how people react to it.
Like that very early Mark transcript that was talked about, one of the chapters, where people are like, oh, this is like 20 years after Mark wrote it or whatever it was. And it's like, oh, actually, it's actually 150 years after, when you look at some of the evidence itself.
And not only that, but that was the third proposed manuscript. That was first century Mark. And even those were not before that, there was a fake that was claimed as a first century gospel. So we haven't had a good track record of first century manuscripts turning out to be first century manuscripts.
Yeah. Dr. Gurry, how would you help this conversation too?
I think it's just important for people to know, like, text criticism is a pretty technical field, and so it is pretty hard to master. And I think for apologists in particular, if depending on what level of apologist you are, you may be expected to be knowledgeable in a lot of different objections to the Christian faith, and the likelihood that you can be really well informed about all of them is, well, let's say it narrows the less time you have to devote to your apologetics ministry, if I can put it that way. Like, we can't all be experts in everything. So one of the reasons why we wrote the book is because we realized this is a technical field. One of the chapters we have is on versions of the New Testament, and we have translations of the New Testament into Syriac, Coptic, and Latin early on, along with other ones after that. And to be knowledgeable in those three languages along with Greek is a tall order for a lot of us. And so we all need help to understand these technical fields well. So we hope that the book really helps people like that, who say, I can't become an expert in this, but I need to learn from people who are. And that's one of the reasons why another reason why we picked younger scholars, is because most of them were either doing their dissertation, like doing their PhD, or they had just finished. And frankly, that's kind of when things are freshest and sharpest in your mind. The PhD student is writing their dissertation. They are super worried about getting something wrong. And so they tend to dot all their I's and cross all their T's. And that's why dissertations could be not the easiest reads, because they tend to be like, super nuanced at every point. But we felt like that was a benefit of this book, to say, let's have people who are being really careful and really particular about things. So I don't know, that's part of what I would say, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I think reading this book, by no means is anyone going to be anything close to it. The test, and like you said, we don't have to be one to to provide a witness to the faith, but it does help knowing some of the things that maybe we either shouldn't say, or things that we're probably overemphasizing that we actually don't know, or we haven't actually researched ourselves. And like you guys have talked about, it could be a detriment to our witness if we're talking about something that's either old information and we're very confident what we're saying, and it actually gets looked at as like, oh, that's actually not the case. And so it's trying to be as objective, like you talked about at the very beginning of this, as possible about some of these things. And that's not going to be the thing that wins somebody to it. It's just being a good witness to the evidence that we have. So last question, easiest question we're going to have for today, maybe as we end out, we'll start with Dr. Gurry. Where can people find you, your work? If you have social media handles or anything that's coming out in the future, by the time this comes out, we'll already have interviewed you for a book. But yeah, so it's, where are you at? Where can people find you? What's the work that you got coming up?
Sure. So a couple places. I co-direct what's called the Text Canon Institute at Phoenix Seminary, and listeners can go to textandcanon.org. That's canon with one N. Well,
yep.
two.
Not the cannon that booms, but the cannon that rules.
Sure. So CANON. And there we have articles twice a month on the question of how we got the Bible. Most of them are aimed at a pretty wide audience and intended to be pretty accessible. So I write there occasionally. You go to Amazon to find my books, I guess. And then the other places, along with Elijah, I blog at a blog called Evangelical Textual Criticism. And the best thing to do is that, and you'll find it. That one tends to be a bit more technical. We tend to assume more on the part of the reader than we do at the Text and Canon website. So if you're new to the topic, go to textandcanon.org. But if you want to become a bit of an armchair expert, let's say, you might want to start reading the ETC blog, as we call it. So
gotcha. Awesome. Yeah. Dr. Hixson, where can people find you and your work?
They can usually find me in a cold, dark cave under the bridge.
Is that where you're at right now, the cold, dark cave?
I had to open my blinds because I didn't think my preference was bright enough for video.
I see.
But I close them as soon as we're over and make it dark in here again. No, I'm generally, I want to be reclusive and just not engage in that stuff. I don't have time. I don't want to take the time that, it's going to stress me out to think of, how do I respond to this? And I'm just not good at sorting through all that. So for me, it's better. What are you saying?
I said, you're not on TikTok yet.
I'm not.
Neither am I. So you're in good company.
I blog occasionally at the Evangelical Textual Criticism blog. Partly because I can sort of hide behind a group and it doesn't depend on me. No, not partly. That's 100% the reason. Recently I've made a series of videos with 3 other friends. It's called the Textual Confidence Collective, and they've been releasing every Monday. The 5th of 7 just came out this week. By the time this is released, they should be all out.
Yep.
But they're posted on Mark Ward's YouTube channel.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah, we'll link to all these things. So if people want to kind of dive deeper, there'll be some links that they can go to. But thanks for your work. Thanks for editing this work and helping us better think about this stuff. And if people want to pick up this book, go to the show notes and they can pick this up and look at your blogs and look at some of the things and the video series and help them better engage with the text. Again, not to try to become experts in this, but at least have some knowledge of this, or if they're friends or if they read an article, they have something in the back of their minds like, oh, I've read something about this. This is not kind of totally new and foreign to me. So yeah, thanks for coming on. And hopefully this is a good resource for those who are either scared of it or don't know anything about it. And they're like, what does New Testament textual criticism have to do with my faith? It's not everything, but it's a little bit of something. So yeah, thanks for coming on to talk about this stuff.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.